Thank you for choosing Smile Set&Go. Before we proceed, may I invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification to get the latest update. If you appreciate the content, please click the like and share buttons. Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. Chapter 2. Siri sat stunned, in a rattling carriage, her homeland growing more and more distant with each bump and shake. 2 days had passed, and she still didn't understand. This was supposed to be Vivena's task. Everybody understood that. Idris had thrown a celebration on the day of Vivena's birth. The king had started her classes from the day she could walk, training her in the ways of court life and politics. Fafan, the second daughter, had also taken the lessons in case Vivena died before the day of the wedding. But not Siri. She'd been redundant. Unimportant. No more. She glanced out the window. Her father had sent the kingdom's nicest carriage along with an honor guard of 20 soldiers to bear her southward. That, combined with a steward and several serving boys, made for a procession as grand as Siri had ever seen. It bordered on ostentation, which might have thrilled her, had it not been bearing her away from Idris. This isn't the way it's supposed to be, she thought. This isn't the way any of it is supposed to happen. And yet it had. Nothing made sense. The carriage bumped, but she just sat numb. At the very least, she thought they could have let me ride horseback, rather than forcing me to sit in this carriage. But that, unfortunately, wouldn't have been an appropriate way to enter Hallandren. Hallandren. She felt her hair bleach white with fear. She was being sent to Hallandren, a kingdom her people cursed with every second breath. She wouldn't see her father again for a long while, if ever. She wouldn't speak with Vivena, or listen to the tutors, or be chided by Mav, or ride the royal horses, or go looking for flowers in the wilderness, or work in the kitchens. She'd marry the God King. The terror of Hallandren, the monster that had never drawn a living breath. In Hallandren, his power was absolute. He could order an execution on a whim. I'll be safe though, won't I? She thought. I'll be his wife. I'm getting married. Oh Oster, god of colors. She thought, feeling sick. She curled up with her legs against her chest, her hair growing so white that it seemed to shine, and lay down on the seat of the carriage, not sure if the shaking she felt was her own trembling or the carriage continuing its inexorable path southward. I think that you should reconsider your decision, father, Vivena said calmly, sitting decorously as she'd been trained with hands in her lap. I've considered and reconsidered, Vivena, King Dedelin said, waving his hand. My mind is made up. Siri is not suited to this task. She'll do fine, her father said, looking through some papers on his desk. All she really needs to do is have a baby. I'm certain she's suited to that task. What then of my training? Vivena thought. 22 years of preparation. What was that, if the only point in being sent was to provide a convenient womb? She kept her hair black, her voice solemn, her face calm. Siri must be distraught, she said. I don't think she's emotionally capable of dealing with this. Her father looked up, his hair fading a bit red, the black bleeding away like paint running off a canvas. It showed his annoyance. He's more upset by her departure than he's willing to admit. This is for the best for our people, Vivena, he said, working with obvious effort to turn his hair black again. If war comes, Idris will need you here. If war comes, what of Siri? Her father fell silent. Perhaps it won't come, he finally said. Oster. Vivena thought with shock. He doesn't believe that. He thinks he's sent her to her death. I know what you are thinking, her father said, drawing her attention back to his eyes. So solemn. How could I choose one over the other? How could I send Siri to die and leave you here to live? I didn't do it based on personal preference, no matter what people may think. I did what will be best for Idris when this war comes. When this war comes. Vivena looked up, meeting his eyes. I was going to stop the war, father. I was to be the God King's bride. I was going to speak with him, persuade him. I've been trained with the political knowledge, the understanding of customs, that stop the war. Her father asked, cutting in. Only then did Vivena realize how brash she must have sounded. She looked away. Vivena, child, her father said. There is no stopping this war. Only the promise of a daughter of the royal line kept them away this long, and sending Siri may buy us time. And, perhaps I've sent her to safety even when war flares. Perhaps they will value her bloodline to the point that they leave her alive, a backup should the heir she bears pass away. He grew distant. Yes, he continued, perhaps it is not Siri we should be fearing for them. But ourselves, Vivina finished in her mind. She was not privy to all of her father's war planning, but she knew enough. War would not favor Idris. In a conflict with Hallandren, there was little chance they would win. It would be devastating for their people and their way of life. Father, I pleased Vivina, he said quietly. I cannot speak of this further. Go now. We will converse later. Later. After Ciri had traveled even further away, after it would be much more difficult to bring her back without looking foolish. Yet Vivina rose. She was obedient, it was the way she had been trained. That was one of the things that had always separated her from her sister. She left her father's study, closing the door behind her, then walked through the wooden palace hallways, pretending that she didn't see the stairs or hear the whispers. She made her way to her room, which was small and unadorned, and sat down on her bed, hands in her lap. She didn't agree at all with her father's assessment. She could have done something. She was to have been the God King's bride. That would have given her influence in the court. Everyone knew that the God King himself was distant when it came to the politics of his nation, but surely his wife could have played a role in defending the interests of her people. And her father had thrown that away. He really must believe that there is nothing that can be done to stop the invasion. That turned sending Ciri into simply another political maneuver to buy time. Just like Idris had been doing for decades. Either way, if the sacrifice of a royal daughter to the Hallandren was that important, then it still should have been Vivina's place to go. It had always been her duty to prepare for marriage to the God King. Not Ciri's, not Fafin's. Vivina's. In being saved, she didn't feel grateful. Nor did she feel that she would better serve Idris by staying in Bevelis. If her father died, Yarda would be far better suited to rule during wartime than Vivina. Besides, Ridger, Vivina's younger brother, had been groomed as heir for years. She had been preserved for no reason. It seemed a punishment, in some ways. She'd listened, prepared, learned, and practiced. Everyone said that she was perfect. Why, then, wasn't she good enough to serve as intended? She had no good answer for herself. She could only sit and fret, hands in her lap, and face the awful truth. Her purpose in life had been stolen and given to another. She was redundant now. Useless. Unimportant. What was he thinking? Ciri snapped, hanging half out the window of her carriage as it bounced along the earthen road. A young soldier marched beside the vehicle, looking uncomfortable in the afternoon light. I mean really, Ciri said. Sending me to marry the Hallandren king. That's silly, isn't it? Surely you've heard about the kinds of things I do. Wandering off when nobody's looking. Ignoring my lessons. I throw angry fits, for color's sake. The guard glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, but otherwise gave no reaction. Ciri didn't really care. She wasn't yelling at him so much as just yelling. She hung precariously from the window, feeling the wind play with her hair, long, red, straight, and stoking her anger. Fury kept her from weeping. The green spring hills of the Idris Highlands had slowly faded away as the days had passed. In fact, they were probably in Hallandren already. The border between the two kingdoms was vague, which wasn't surprising, considering that they'd been one nation up until the Many War. She eyed the poor guard whose only way of dealing with a raving princess was ignoring her. Then she finally slumped back into the carriage. She shouldn't have treated him so, but, well, she'd just been sold off like some hunk of mud and doomed by a document that had been written years before she'd even been born. If anyone had a right to a tantrum, it was Ciri. Maybe that's the reason for all of this, she thought, crossing her arms on the windowsill. Maybe father was tired of my tantrums, and just wanted to get rid of me. That seemed a little far-fetched. There were easier ways to deal with Ciri, ways that didn't include sending her to represent Idris in a foreign court. Why, then, did he really think she'd do a good job? That gave her pause. Then she considered how ridiculous it was. Her father wouldn't have assumed that she'd do a better job than Vivina. Nobody did anything better than Vivina. Ciri sighed, feeling her hair turn a pensive brown. At least the landscape was interesting, and in order to keep herself from feeling any more frustrated, she let it distract her for the moment. Hallandren was in the lowlands, a place of tropical forests and strange, colorful animals. Ciri had heard the descriptions from Rambleman, and even confirmed their accounts in the occasional book she'd been forced to read. She thought she knew what to expect. Yet as the hills gave way to deep grasslands and then the trees finally began to crowd the road, Ciri began to realize that there was something no tome or tale could adequately describe. Colors. In the highlands, flower patches were rare and unconnected, as if they understood how poorly they fit with Idris' philosophy. Here, they appeared to be everywhere. Tiny flowers grew in great blanketing swaths on the ground. Large, drooping pink blossoms hung from trees, like bundles of grapes, flowers growing practically on top of one another in a large cluster. Even the weeds had flowers. Siri would have picked some of them, if not for the way that the soldiers regarded them with hostility. If I feel this anxious, she realized, those guards must feel more so. She wasn't the only one who had been sent away from family and friends. When would these men be allowed to return? Suddenly, she felt even more guilty for subjecting the young soldier to her outburst. I'll send them back when I arrive, she thought. Then she immediately felt her hair grow white. Sending the men back would leave her alone in a city filled with lifeless, awakeners, and pagans. Yet what good would 20 soldiers do her? Better that someone, at least, be allowed to return home. One would think that you would be happy, Fafan said. After all, you no longer have to marry a tyrant. Vivina plopped a bruise-colored berry into her basket, then moved on to a different bush. Fafan worked on one nearby. She wore the white robes of a monk, her hair completely shorn. Fafan was the middle sister in almost every way, midway between Siri and Vivina in height, less proper than Vivina, yet hardly as careless as Siri. Fafan was a bit curvier than either of them, which had caught the eyes of several young men in the village. However, the fact that they would have to become monks themselves if they wanted to marry her kept them in check. If Fafan noticed how popular she was, she'd never shown it. She'd made the decision to become a monk before her 10th birthday, and her father had wholeheartedly approved. Every noble or rich family was traditionally obligated to provide one person to the monasteries. It was against the 5 visions to be selfish, even with one's own blood. The 2 sisters gathered berries which Fafan would later distribute to those in need. The monk's fingers were dyed slightly purple by the work. Vivina wore gloves. That much color on her hands would be unseemly. Yes, Fafan said, I do think you're taking this all wrong. Why, you act as if you want to go down and be married to that lifeless monster. He's not lifeless, Vivina said. Suzbran is returned, and there is a large difference. Yes, but he's a false god. Besides, everyone knows what a terrible creature he is. But it was my place to go and marry him. That is who I am, Fafan. Without it, I am nothing. Nonsense, Fafan said. You'll inherit now, instead of Ridger. Thereby unsettling the order of things even further, Vivina thought. What right do I have to take his place from him? She allowed this aspect of the conversation to lapse, however. She'd been arguing the point for several minutes now, and it wouldn't be proper to continue. Proper. Rarely before had Vivina felt so frustrated at having to be proper. Her emotions were growing rather inconvenient. What of Siri? She found herself saying. You're happy that this happened to her. Fafan looked up then frowned a little to herself. She had a tendency to avoid thinking things through unless she was confronted with them directly. Vivina felt a little ashamed for making such a blunt comment, but with Fafan, there often wasn't any other way. You do have a point, Fafan said. I don't see why anyone had to be sent. The treaty, Vivina said. It protects our people. Oster protects our people, Fafan said, moving on to another bush. Will he protect Siri? Vivina though. Poor, innocent, capricious Siri. She'd never learned to control herself, she'd be eaten alive in the Halandran court of gods. Siri wouldn't understand the politics, the backstabbing, the false faces and lies. She would also be forced to bear the next god king of Halandran. Performing that duty was not something Vivina had looked forward to. It would have been a sacrifice, yet it would have been her sacrifice, given willingly for the safety of her people. Such thoughts continued to pester Vivina as she and Fafan finished with the berry picking, then moved down the hillside back toward the village. Fafan, like all monks, dedicated all of her work to the good of the people. She watched flocks, harvested food, and cleaned houses for those who could not do it themselves. Without a duty of her own, Vivina had little purpose. And yet, as she considered it, there was someone who still needed her. Someone who had left a week before, teary-eyed and frightened, looking to her big sister with desperation. Vivina wasn't needed in Idris, whatever her father said. She was useless here. But she did know the people, cultures, and society of Halandran. And as she followed Fafan onto the village road, an idea began to form in Vivina's head. One that was not by any stretch of the imagination proper. Smile Set&Go appreciates your time. Before we end, may I invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification to get the latest update. If you like the content, please click the like and share buttons. Thank you and have a great day.